Today we're really fortunate to have Dr. Joel Baden from Yale University. Joel is probably one of the most distinguished young scholars of his generation. It's pretty impressive when I look at Joel's resume. I knew most of this, but when I start looking at it in one place, it becomes even more impressive. Joel did his doctorate at Harvard. Actually did his BA at Yale, so he went back to Yale to teach. They knew a good thing, and they brought him back. He has published 5 books now. Well, we can't really count the Exodus commentaries because he says that it's expected in 2025. That's really,
when the publisher lets you do something like that, you say thank you.
It makes you not only a great biblical scholar, but a prophet. But he has a book. He's one of the certainly foremost American scholars working on Pentateuchal criticism, and one of the major scholars in Pentateuchal criticism in the world. His first book was J.E. and the Redaction of the Pentateuch. That was published by Moore Seebeck in 2009. He also wrote The Composition of the Pentateuch, Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis in the Anchor Yale Bible Reference Library series, which is now in press. Isn't it out?
No, it's out.
It says in press.
Yeah, it's out.
It just came out this last year. He also, I see, has another book coming out, The Promises to the Patriarchs, with Oxford University
Just
Press.
came out this week.
So I haven't seen it yet.
I haven't seen it either.
Okay.
But I was told this morning it's out.
And so you can see that he's written a number of important works. He's also edited a book, The Strata of Priestly Writings, Contemporary Debate and Future Directions, which is an important compendium of sort of the state of studies on Pentateuchal studies. And his editing of the work is, again, representative of his status in the field. And we're really fortunate today to have him speaking on a topic in this area, layers and unities in biblical texts. So, with no more ado, I give you Joel.
Thank you. Thank you for a very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Bill for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to spend February in Los Angeles rather than in Connecticut, most of all. So the handout I'm not going to get to, which, did everyone have the handout? Make sure? Okay. I'm not going to get the handout until a little over halfway through, so you need not concern yourselves with it yet. That's the handout right there.
Are there more copies of the handout?
So I will get going without it for the moment. With the exception of only the staunchest conservative biblical scholars, most everyone admits that the Bible, and particularly the Pentateuch, has a complicated literary history. The contradictions, repetitions, gaps, and other narrative discrepancies found all too frequently in the biblical text have, for more than 300 years, led scholars to the conclusion that the Pentateuch could not have been written by a single hand, but must rather be the product of many different individuals working at different times. The question has thus become how we imagine the various authors and editors to have worked, and how best to account for the present state of the canonical text. Almost innumerable variations on the compositional history of the Pentateuch have been proposed in the history of critical scholarship, but they all boil down to one of two, or two of two, basic options, which can be then combined in different ways. And these basic options are sources and layers. And those terms probably require some defining. A source, as classically understood, is an independent document, a unity, one that can and was originally intended to stand on its own, apart from any other biblical or non-biblical text. In the standard documentary hypothesis, the Pentateuch is essentially the combination of 4 such sources, which we call J, E, D, and P. According to this theory, Each of these documents was intended to and can be read without any knowledge of or reference to any of the others. There are, however, other examples of sources. The old poems embedded in the Pentateuch and elsewhere in the Bible, Genesis 49, Exodus 15, Deuteronomy 33, Judges 5, etc. These could well be defined as sources also. These too were originally independent literary units. In contrast to sources, layers are those writings that were never intended to be independent, are not unities in and of themselves, but were rather conceived from the start as additions to pre-existing texts. Perhaps the most commonly accepted example of such a layer is the Holiness Code of Leviticus 17 through 26, the legal corpus that, as virtually everyone recognizes, is a later addition to the original ritual legislation contained in Leviticus 1 through 16. In contemporary non-documentary theories of the composition of the Pentateuch, layers are the dominant mechanism of literary growth. For example, the patriarchal promises are all understood to be a later layer, actually multiple successive layers, over an ever-growing patriarchal cycle. According to some, even the flood story, one of the classic examples of two independent sources, is in fact an example of one original story with a later supplementary layer. Actually, people argue about which one is the original and which one is supplementary, which to my mind is a good reason to think it's all nonsense. For the most part, those scholars who are fond of sources have been reluctant to embrace layers. And those who like to find layers have been averse to the possible existence of sources. This division stems in large part, I believe, from the desire of each side to present as consistent a view as possible. It's far easier to argue for one compositional mechanism than for two. And if one wants to argue for a predominance of sources, then admitting that there are some layers seems like it's opening the door for layers to just take over, and vice versa. I would like to suggest that it is not only possible, but in fact necessary, for us to accept that there are both sources and layers in the biblical text, and that to think otherwise is to drastically oversimplify the undoubtedly complex growth of the Pentateuch. The key, however, is to be very clear, with firm methodological grounds as to what a source should look like and how it is to be identified, and what a layer should look like and how it is to be identified. And then we might be able to see how the two interact and lead to the text we have before us. So allow me to posit what I consider to be a fundamental principle. The most significant criterion in the question of the composition of the Pentateuch is narrative coherence. That is, agreement on the basic plot level of who, what, when, where, why, and how. From the very beginnings of critical scholarship, this, that is, the problems of reading the canonical text as a straightforward narrative, this was the question that drove the field forward. And those who tell you otherwise are mistaken. All of the great examples of problems in the Pentateuch are on this level. The flood story, to take the most famous example, is impossible to read because God twice decides to destroy the earth, though for different reasons, because God commands Noah to take animals onto the ark twice, though in different numbers, because the waters covered the earth for both 40 days and 150 days, because the waters come from different places in different verses, because Noah sends different birds to do the same job, and so forth. On these narratological grounds, that is, on the plot level, the canonical flood story can be and has long been divided into two perfectly coherent accounts, each totally readable on its own, each with its own independent and exclusive claims about what happened. It is also true that one story uses the tetragrammaton, while the other uses the divine title God. But it would be wrong to think that this verbal difference is the key to the literary analysis. It's the narrative, the plot, that drives the division. That is to say, if the flood story were perfectly readable in all of its narrative details, and also happened to alternate the names for God, we would never have thought that it was originally two distinct stories. And this is true for the entire Pentateuch. Varying style, terminology, even theme and theologies, these are not the basis for the division of the text. the need to divide the text is based primarily, if not exclusively, on the contradictions found in the narrative, that is, in the plot. This principle I've just articulated is important because it's on this basis that we can see an important difference between sources and layers. Two sources will disagree with each other in terms of their narrative claims. Two layers will not. This is actually, I think, no more than simple logic. Sources are defined by their independence. Right? There's no reason that they should agree with each other, as they were never meant to be read together. In fact, they fundamentally cannot agree with each other, because if they did, we wouldn't have been able to identify them in the first place. Again, if the canonical flood story agreed in all of its narrative particulars, there would be no reason to posit multiple sources. It must be remembered that everyone who puts pen to paper does so in order to make an argument, to make a claim that's distinctive in some way. And in the biblical realm, there were these two choices. Write something entirely new and independent, a source, or write something to be attached to a pre-existing material, that is, a layer. If one chooses to write a source, something independent, one can say whatever one wants. But if one chooses to write a layer to be added to pre-existing material, one is constrained by, at the very least, the narrative claims of that earlier material. Because if I write something with narrative claims that disagree with the text to which I am attaching my layer, then the point I am trying to make will necessarily get lost in the resulting combination. I'll give you the flood story again as an example, for the sake of argument. Let's say that an earlier text said that Noah took 7 pairs of clean animals onto the ark, and that the flood was the result of heavy rain, and that it lasted 40 days, and that Noah sent out a dove. Right? Those are the narrative claims of this existing text. Now I want to come along and say that in fact Noah took 1 pair of every animal, that the flood came from the opening of the primordial floodgates above and below, that it lasted 150 days, and that Noah sent out a raven. That's my claims. If I combine my claims with the earlier story, if I layer my claims on top of the pre-existing narrative, then the resulting text will not in fact represent my ideas. It will rather represent both ideas equally. No reader would be able to tell whether I, the later author, the person who should be determining how the final text is read, no one will ever be able to understand or recognize what I believe, which is that the flood lasted 40 or 150 days. No one would ever be able to tell. Both claims will be present equally in the combined text. In other words, it makes no sense for someone with a different set of narrative claims to write a layer, as those claims will necessarily be swallowed up by the final form of the text. Right? If I have different claims, I really ought to just write my own version. If, on the other hand, one is willing to accept whatever a pre-existing text says and wants only to supplement it, expand it, nuance it, then a layer is certainly the more appropriate mechanism, while an entirely new source would be entirely unnecessary. So in a layer, we may well see shifts in style, terminology, theme, and theology, but all while maintaining the narrative claims of the pre-existing material. A significant point, and one that we as modern scholars routinely forget, is that the recognition that texts are composite and the ability to identify the elements that make up such texts is distinctly modern. That is, we look at the flood story and see 2 narratives that have been interwoven. But we have to remember that for 2,000 years, from the moment that the canonical text came into being until maybe the 17th century, no one ever thought that Genesis 6 through 9 was anything other than a unified text. When we look at the book of Leviticus, we see 2 layers. No one ever saw those layers until the advent of critical scholarship. So in order to understand how these texts came into being, we have to put ourselves back into the minds and pens of the original readers and editors of these materials. In practice, what this means is that we have to understand that sources and layers behave differently with regard to their related texts. So for example, the author of the Pentateuchal source D found in the majority of the book of Deuteronomy, was, I'm pretty sure, fully aware of the earlier J and E documents. And he wrote his text to be the single, self-standing, true account of Israel's history over and above those of J and E. But because he wrote a source, he didn't obliterate the independent existences of J and E. That is, he added to the extant collection of texts. On the other hand, the author of the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 through 26 wrote a layer. He supplemented the pre-existing ritual legislation of Leviticus 1 through 16 and the rest of the priestly text. When he finished his work, there were not now two texts, his and that which preceded him. There is one, the combined, layered text of Leviticus. That is, there's no longer any such thing as the original priestly text. It was obliterated from existence until it was rediscovered by modern scholarship. As the author of H, the Holiness Code, did not add to the extant collection of texts. He changed an existing text. As we've already noted, this is also true, of course, when two sources are combined by a third party, as in the case of the flood story. Once the sources J and P have been interwoven into a single narrative, there is no such thing as J and P anymore. There is only the flood story. Adding to the confusion is the realization that, depending on the context, what was once a layer can turn into a source. So, for example, the Holiness Code in Leviticus was originally a layer added to the pre-existing priestly material. Once this layer was placed over the priestly text, however, what resulted was a new unity, which looked and acted for all the world like an independent source. And of course, there's nothing to say that any given text can support only one additional layer. The priestly text of the Pentateuch may well comprise 3 or more layers. But after each layer is added, what we're left with is an independent, unified source, and one that eventually would be combined with the other Pentateuchal sources, each of which could also well comprise a number of layers. And when sources are combined with each other, resulting in a new unity, there can then be layers on top of that unified text. I'm going to assume at this point that most people are lost. And so maybe it is best to turn then to an example that I hope will illustrate something of what's at stake here. And at that point, when we get to questions, we can think of many more such examples. Given the relatively complicated situation I just described, I want to keep one relatively simple question in mind. If we are going to posit a distinct author, be it of a source or a layer, we have to always ask, what does this supposed author know of the texts that preceded him? If we can determine the answer to that relatively simple question, we can learn a lot about how these biblical materials were written. So to the example, and this is your handout, the, I think, relatively little known story of Numbers 16 to 17. In Numbers 16, first page of your handout, there's 2 pages. In Numbers 16, we have, by virtual consensus, 2 distinct narratives. That of Korah and his rebellion against the priestly leadership of Aaron, in italics, and that of Dathan and Abiram and their rebellion against the prophetic leadership of Moses, not in italics. On your handout, you can see these 2 stories, both as they are interwoven in the canonical text, that's the first 2 pages, and then as they would have existed separately, those are the following 2 pages. Suffice it to say that it is very difficult, well nigh impossible, to imagine that either one of these stories was written as a layer or a supplement of the other. The resulting story, the one we have in the canonical text, is an utter mess, with serious narrative problems. To point out just a few, Dathan and Abiram are, according to the first verses, supposed to be part of Korah's band. Korah took himself, along with Dathan and Abiram, to rise up against Moses. They're supposed to be part of Korah's band, but they seem not to be in the same place as Korah at any point in the story. Korah and his people, for their part, are magically relocated from their position in front of the tent of the meeting in verse 18, where each of them took his fire pan and laid incense on it, to the tents of Dathan and Aviram in verse 32, where they are swallowed by the earth, all of Korah's people and all their possessions. They're swallowed by the earth in verse 32, just before they are naturally burned to death by divine fire, back at the tent of meeting in verse 35. These are two independent stories. They read perfectly when separated, they deal with separate topics, and they disagree about almost every aspect of the plot. We can, as almost everyone has, see that what we have here are two sources that have been combined into a single account. When we turn to number 17, the next page of your handout, when we turn to number 17, it starts to get somewhat more complicated. There are three distinct sections in this chapter, and I've marked them off by tabs. In verses 1 through 5, we have Eleazar, Aaron's son, taking the fire pans and turning them into plating for the altar as a reminder that no one other than Aaron and his sons should offer incense before the Lord. In verses 6 through 15, we have the Israelites yelling at Moses and Aaron for bringing death upon the community, for which they are struck with the plague that Aaron must halt by offering incense in the midst of the people. In verses 16 through 28, each Israelite tribe brings its chieftain's staff and puts it in the tent of meeting, and the next morning Aaron's staff has sprouted blossoms and almonds, thereby identifying him as the only divinely ordained priest. Three stories here, all of which seem to serve the same purpose, which is to mark Aaron as distinct from the rest of the Israelites, and, at least in the first and last of the stories, to produce a lasting reminder to the Israelites of this fact. This functional repetition has led many scholars to suppose that there are multiple layers in Numbers 17. As is to be expected, there is then a wide variety of suggestions as to which of these passages is first and which is last, and how they are related to each other, and most importantly, how they are related to the text of Numbers 16. In recent scholarship, it has become common to argue that some or all of Numbers 17 is a supplementary layer to the combined Korah and Dathan and Aviram stories of Numbers 16. That is, that the independent Korah story and the independent Dathan and Aviram story were combined into a single narrative, Numbers 16 essentially as we now have it, and then the various sections of Number 17 were written as supplementary layers to that. That's the common view these days. And there is, in theory, nothing impossible about such a scenario. That well may be what had happened, in theory. In practice, however, this idea falls apart. And the issue is this. In each of these three sections of Number 17, in each one of them independently, there is nothing that even remotely relates to the Dathan and Aviram material of Numbers 16. They are never mentioned by name, while Korah is mentioned repeatedly. There's nothing in these sections about the earth opening, but there's plenty about fire and incense. There's nothing about Moses' prophetic authority, but everything about Aaron's priestly authority. And this is where the theoretical points I was making earlier about what happens when texts are combined comes into play. That is, if number 17 is thought to have been written as a supplement to the combined number 16, there is no possible way it could have avoided all mention of Dathan and Aviram. From the very moment that the two texts of number 16 were fused into a single story, there were no two texts. There was no longer a Korah story and a Dathan and Aviram story. There was only a Korah, Dathan, and Aviram story. There was no longer a story about rebellion against Moses and a story about rebellion against Aaron. There's now only a story about rebellion against Moses and Aaron together. No longer a story about the earth opening and a story about fire consuming, but a story about the earth opening and fire consuming together. Any authors imagined to have known the combined text of number 16, therefore, cannot be imagined to have reacted to only one of the strata that we, modern biblical critics, identify in the text. It's thus impossible to imagine that an author, much less a series of authors, writing on the basis of the canonical text of number 16, would have systematically ignored the Dathan and Aviram story in favor of the Korah story. There were no such stories. The only way the author or authors of number 17 could have written the texts they did is if the only story they had in front of them was the story of Korah's revolt. Unless we want to say that these biblical authors were the original source critics, and really very good ones. In short, even if one wishes to argue that Dathan and Aviram material set aside, there are multiple strata in numbers 16 and 17. There's no basis whatsoever to think that they are anything other than layers of the Korah story. They are not additions to the combined Korah and Dathan and Aviram narrative. What we have then is potentially evidence for multiple layers of a single story. That is the Korah story. 1, 2, maybe as many as 4 layers. But with the addition of each successive layer, the text ceases, for all functional purposes, to be layered. It is at each stage a unity, a source. And after the addition of the last layer, whichever it may be, the Korah source was combined with another source, the Dathan and Aviram story. And once they were combined, there were no longer 2 sources, but a single source, what we call numbers 16 to 17. As I suggested before, it is possible that after the combination of sources, a later layer can indeed come along and supplement that new unity. And we actually have an example of that with regard to these chapters of Numbers. In Numbers 26, in the midst of a perfectly nice census list, we find, upon arriving at the genealogy of Reuben, the following. The descendants of Eliab were Nemuel, Dathan, and Aviram. These are the same Dathan and Aviram, men of the assembly, who rebelled against Moses and Aaron in the congregation of Korah, when they rebelled against the Lord, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with Korah, when that congregation died, when the fire consumed the 250 men, and they became an example, but the sons of Korah did not die. This, it could not be clearer, reflects the canonical story of number 16, with all of its confusions about who rebelled against whom, with whom, and where it was everyone died. This is what it looks like when a later author knows a text that we now recognize as comprising multiple strata. The author of this passage in Numbers 26 makes no attempt to separate the stories, makes no distinction between them, and nor should he, or better, nor could he. Once they were combined, they were one story, a unity, for thousands of years. So what's the upshot of all this? And then we'll have plenty of time to talk. First, and obviously, the composition of the Pentateuch is a tricky business. More practically, when we have a clearer sense of how to distinguish a source from a layer, and how to think about what a layer is actually attaching itself to, we get a far better picture of the mechanisms by which the Pentateuch came into being. Not every passage we can identify as a layer is necessarily late. Although most people seem to think that's the case, as there are layers within early texts. And not every passage is dependent on something that preceded it. But for those that are dependent on a pre-existing text, it need not be the canonical text we have before us. Recognition of layers that are not dependent on the canonical text actually leads to the identification of sources. When we see that number 17 is dependent exclusively on the Korah story, we can be pretty sure, I would say entirely certain, that the Korah story must have existed independently, that is to say, as a source, from the Dathan and Aviram story with which it has been combined, and of course, vice versa. That is, recognizing the layer, that number 17 is a layer of number 16, but not of all of number 16, means that we have to have had sources in number 16. In short, if we are really clear about what constitutes a source and what constitutes a layer, and how to define and identify them, we can actually accept the idea that both mechanisms are at play in the biblical text. In its complexity, this situation is almost certainly truer than any theory that posits only one mechanism. But in its added clarity, we can maintain some semblance of precision, and I hope objectivity, in our analysis of the literary jumble. That's what I have to say. Now I'm happy to talk. Thank you.
Question, Gershon?
That's very fascinating. A question and a comment. Question. Hermeneutic revision, does that distinguish, to your mind, does that help to identify a layer or a later source? Obviously there's a source, it's a layer. We see it, I mean, it's obvious in the holiness code versus the priestly code, but do you find it also in Genesis and other layers? That was my question. My point about the absence of Dathan and reorient in chapter 17. It's like the dog didn't bark, isn't it? And therefore it is a clue. Now you've taken it as a clue to for the hypothesis that you built, but maybe their absence is because they're Reubenites. And 17 is about Aaron, as you yourself pointed out. Reubenites are irrelevant to Aaron, according to chapter 17. Korah, being a Levite, is relevant, and so he's suppressed because of relevancy. He blurs the polemic in 17, which is that only Aaron, of course, ends with the budding blood. So it's not necessarily bad writing, as I see it.
I'll address the second point first. There's no question that number 17 is concerned entirely with Aaron and with Aaron's position. And certainly Korah's entire story is about Aaron's position vis-a-vis the people. The problem is, if the author of number 17, or authors, whatever you want to say, was reading the combined number 16, he may have concentrated on Korah, but I find it pretty unbelievable that he would have been capable of eliminating every last detail. It's one thing to concentrate on Korah and not mention Dathan and Aviram by name. It's another thing to not think the earth ever opened up and swallowed anybody, because that's how number 16 says everybody died, including Korah's men. Whereas number 17, they clearly all died by fire. There's no mention of any challenge to Moses, even though, according to the canonical text, that is certainly part of the issue here. There's also, and I didn't mention this, there's also a question of language, which is that number 17 uses almost entirely not a single word of what we think of as the the usual language of the Dathan and Aviram story. And it is saturated with priestly language. Now again, that may be an issue of what it's concentrating on, but it's, again, I find it impossible that somebody who knew number 16 as a combined text would be able to say, all of these words are related to what I care about, or all of these words are somehow superfluous, and have it match up exactly with what we as modern commentators are capable of separating out as the two independent texts. Again, the census in Numbers 26, where in theory they should be concentrating only on Dathan and Aviram, because that genealogical, they stopped at the Reubenites, Dathan and Aviram. This Dathan and Aviram, who? But they don't just tell the Dathan and Aviram material, right? It's everything combined.
I just kind of piggyback on, I find that biblical scholars often make these arguments where they think that ancient scholars, ancient writers had this pristine analytical knowledge of the text, where they were where they analyzed it sort of the same as Wellhausen of the text in terms of separating sources. When there's no way, they're not aware of those things. They can be aware of, Korah versus, Dathan, but they're not aware of every single detail. They're not analyzing and reading texts like that. But we often assume this is so clean that it. But there are lots of examples like this. I could go on in other veins, like with this critique of modern biblical scholarship.
Yeah, it's you read any biblical commentator from, let's say, I don't know, the 2nd century BCE through the 17th century CE. No one is going to tell you that Korah and Dathan and Abiram are two different stories or try to interpret them differently. They're all going to be grappling with the obvious narrative problems of the text, but never with the assumption that there are two interwoven stories here. Right? We, modern scholars, invented that. And we tend, however, to then impose that knowledge back onto everybody, especially the earliest readers. We all can sit and recognize that, of course, medieval commentators were not going to be reading this as two separate stories. But the first reader, we seem to think, would have. And that to me is not, doesn't make any sense.
So turning to 17, I just want to, I'm a little bit unclear about how you're reading 17. So you say that there are 3 different narrative sections, each that make the same point. And so you would say that these are all supplementary to the Korah story?
What I would say is, if one wants to argue that they are supplementary, they can be supplementary only to the Korah story.
Okay.
That's the claim I'm making. To be perfectly honest, I don't want to say playing a game here, but I am taking up arguments about the existence of layers and trying to, this happens to be a very, to my mind, clean example. And relatively easy to follow, which is why I use it. Do I think that there are multiple layers here? Probably maybe one. I think there might be a big Korah story that goes into 17, and then maybe an added layer. I think maybe 2. But
where are the layers as you see it in 17? You have a break in between 5 and 6 and 15 and 16. Those are
these are the 3 sections that scholars tend to identify. It started back with Abraham Kunin was the first one to, in a very nice article, to say we have multiple sections here. He had just 1 through 5, and then the rest. This is 2 sections, and scholars have been refining that into 3 sections. And I think it's a logical 3 sections. There are 3 separate events that happen here. They are connected in the narrative. The words "the next day" in verse 6 definitely connect them. But I am willing to think about the possibility that verses 1 through 5 are a later addition. I'm willing to think about it. There are certain aspects of it, particularly this ideology of the copper plating for the altar, which is very weird. It doesn't seem to exactly conform to what we've read elsewhere about that. I can see those verses being an insertion. You take them out and nothing is harmed. That is actually true of each of these 3 sections, right? You pull any one of them out and nothing is harmed.
Well, I guess, yeah, that's what it was a little confusing to me, because you say that the narrative, in theory, each one is, like, they can survive on their own, or the narrative can survive without them.
Yeah.
So then what would be the point in adding additional ones?
Well, I mean, that's the question we then have to ask. Right, so this is actually a very good point about layers. In theory, if you pull out a layer, starting from the latest and moving earlier, at every point you should have a readable text, right? Because there was a readable text before somebody came along and said, I'm going to add a layer to this. So if you take out H from the priestly writings, the original P is perfectly good. You add H, it's still perfectly good. It's just bigger. The question at each stage of why someone wanted to add this So someone maybe added 1 through 5 to explain some etiology of the copper plating. Now, when we get into the question of why someone wanted to add, it can be very sticky. And I think it's worth saying that the identification of layers, because it's not done on what I consider the more objective grounds of narrative contradictions. Right? I like to think, I know that I'm wrong, I like to think that most people can agree on, for example, in the flood story, that it's super obvious what the contradictions are. And we can all agree that the ones I mentioned in the paper, are like good paired contradictions, and there's really not a lot of debate about that. And so we can all sort of agree to split them. Whereas with layers, when there is no such very obvious narrative contradiction, it becomes a question of, well, the plot still works with it, and without it, why did somebody add it? Anyway, it's much more subjective. It's much more subjective. So, my teacher, Baruch Schwartz from Hebrew University, who wrote his dissertation on H, and saying, H is a layer of P, and this really careful, wonderful study of why H cannot exist without P behind it, he's now kind of waffling about whether H exists. Because you can, right? Because it makes sense. Because it's possible to read it all as one, with a sort of development of idea. It becomes more subjective. So with all of these, they could all be taken out, or they could all be original. And so why we think something is a layer is much more subjective. But my point is, whether you think something is a layer or not, we can always identify what it must be added to if one thinks that it's a layer. And that actually becomes very helpful. I am, in theory, okay with as many layers as you want for as many sources as you want. Right? If you want to say J is 52 layers, and you want to say P is 28 layers, it's fine with me. It's subjective, I think probably crazy. But it's theoretically okay, because at the end of the day, the last layer is now the unified final, what we call P or J. And that's what was combined with the other sources. And we know that because the layers react to only certain things that come before them. And that's the principle I'm working with here. So.
You spoke about the last layer. The way archaeologists work at this is usually to concede that your layers are much more difficult than ours in the text.
I don't have nice floors.
Which is why we want to move on. I understand how important it is to ask how the text is able to say what it says. We just want to know whether the last layer is true, historically verifiable, which seems overly simplistic, but that is in fact the way most archaeologists work. You mentioned also the importance of recognizing that the ancients didn't see the same contradictions that we see. For an archaeologist, different subject in a way, but the conflict between Joshua and Judges is one that we have to work with. Both accounts cannot be reconciled with each other, and both can't be reconciled with the archaeological record. So I think we need each other, but we're not getting very far in the dialogue.
I certainly agree with your last statement. I wanted to clarify, it's not that ancient readers didn't recognize contradictions. Right? It is indisputable, in my mind, that the earliest readers, or the earliest comprehensive reading that we have, which is the rabbinic corpus of the first 6 or so centuries, that they recognized, I'm going to say, virtually everything that we recognize as a contradiction. They grappled with it, they worked with it. I mean, I know that you know this. Right? They were the best readers of the text we ever had, and everything that we see, they saw. They dealt with it differently. But they saw it all. In other words, it's not that anyone read number 16 and went, good story, right? Like nobody, I don't think anybody read it and went, I got that, perfect, easy. But no one read it and said, 2 stories, right? They developed hermeneutic methods to deal with these problems. So it's not that they didn't recognize the contradictions. It's just that they never would have occurred to them that we had 2 sources that had been combined. And I think that's important, right? That it's a difference not of ability to read.
Yeah. It seems to me that the editors who put together the Deuteronistic history did resolve the conflict between the two sources, which for us is a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, the example you give, Joshua, and Judges, again, I think that when you read the Deuteronomistic history, you can see how the editor is trying to resolve it, but at the same time, the contradictions are evident. And I don't think that most ancient readers would have been incapable of seeing the problem between Joshua and Judges, right? Seeing that there is some tension there. But they would not have ever thought, oh, I've got a Joshua story and a Judges story that were originally separate and incompatible, and they've been put together, right? They simply had to grapple with what the text is the issue, right? We think of the text as being one thing, and they thought of the biblical text as being something qualitatively different. It's not that we're recognizing things for the first time. We simply read it as a different kind of. I mean, in the post-Enlightenment world, we read the text as something different.
Well, I'm sure the archaeological proof that we adduce for one account or the other would have been no interest whatsoever.
Right.
It's not that much interest to me sometimes.
Yes.
So in my family, my aunt tells a story about my mother, and my mother says, that never happened. And if I were to write the story, I might put in my aunt's version, or my mother's, or both, or different at different times. But it wouldn't fundamentally change the way I felt or remember my aunt or my mother. So I guess I'm asking, what is the fundamental good of trying to do modern critical scholarship and unravel this? What does it do for us?
I really hope I have a good answer. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure I can just leave the field now. So, the kind of literary analysis that I do and that I'm doing here is, at least as I conceive of it, fundamentally a historical project. If it's not a question of evaluating one story against another in terms of what actually happened. For exactly the reason that you say, and for many others, there's no way of accessing what actually happened. I mean, Lord knows you read the flood story, and if we're going to argue about whether it was a dove or a raven, right, that's a little bit, right, it borders on ridiculous. The key is when we separate these stories, when we recognize these contradictions and we pull them apart and we are left with earlier versions, right? And I want to be clear that from virtually beginning to end, the stories that are contained in the Pentateuch cover the same broad spectrum, mostly from creation, patriarchs, in the order we know them, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They went to Egypt with Joseph. There was an exodus. They went through the wilderness for a certain period of time. Certain stuff happened there, and then they entered. Right? Broad overview. In almost every detail, very, very divergent views. And so embedded in these large narratives of Israel's early history, and that are intended not just to say what happened, but obviously have a theological argument to make about Israel's relationship with God. In these very different ways of telling that story, we have access to very different ancient ideas about God and Israel. So that when you read the canonical texts, we end up eliding all of these into one semi-comprehensive, as if there was this one consistent notion. When I read the Torah, I get 4 distinct, very different theological positions about virtually everything, but certainly the fundamental question of God's relationship with the people. And what it allows me to do is recognize that Israel was not, the ancient world was not monolithic in terms of its notions of God, in terms of religion, right? It allows me to recognize that we can't think of ancient Israel as being somehow different in kind from any other society that ever existed, right? There is no example of a unified religious viewpoint in any given culture. Right, our modern culture is an easy example, but right, early Christianity, right, Peter and Paul were already like this, right? Early Islam, right? One generation after Muhammad, and it's the split that has remained ever since. And there's no reason to think that Judaism or ancient Israelite religion or any other was ever any different. There were always multiple competing, maybe not even competing, just existing different views. And if we can pull these texts apart and see those views clearly, now I can actually get a much cleaner picture and a more realistic, I think, picture of what the ancient society looked like. Different parts of society, priests and people in the royal court, and prophets, and people in different locales, north, south, with different ideas, what they thought. I've got now a nice historical picture of ancient Israel. It does not have to impact how we as modern readers understand the text, but it can. Right? There is a contemporary interpretive benefit to saying that's how it was. Because now I read the flood story, and I don't have to go, raven or dove, 40 or 150. Right? I can intellectually know that what I have is a combination, and I can recognize that sort of you're relieved from the need to make it make sense, which I think is helpful. But you also get an opportunity to say, so this part of the text really cares about this and is arguing this, and this one is arguing something different, and they're both scriptural, right? If we have multiple different views that are all part of what we consider the authoritative Bible, that's useful to me interpretively and theoretically, right? We can recognize divergence and variety within the single text. The Bible encodes pluriformity and multivocality in a way that I think is culturally useful for us today. And you can then play with that in a whole variety of interesting ways. I think it makes the experience more interesting and fuller, and certainly, as I said, really helps with what would otherwise be real head scratchers in the text.
Is it fair and relevant to ask why the two stories were combined?
Yep.
In other words, okay, no,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. At every stage, right? It's always, and this is actually a really. I'm glad you asked. This is one of the more interesting examples. The Torah, right? For the most part, the Torah is combined like this, right? On the broad scale, you have four sources that were interwoven. And that's, you see it right from the beginning. Genesis 1 is one creation story, Genesis 2 is another one, Genesis 5 picks up back up with the first, and then they continue sort of like this all the way through. On the level of the individual episode, there are some that are interwoven, and many that are just placed back to back. So the classic example of the interwoven one is the flood story, where there is no question why they had to be interwoven, right? Why do we only have one flood story instead of flood story 1 and then flood story 2? Because quite obviously, you can't have God destroying the earth, vowing never to destroy it again, and then in the next moment, destroying the earth and vowing to, right? It's a singular occurrence, historically. Singular occurrence that could never be repeated. The same is true of the other stories that are interwoven that way. Right? Joseph going down to Egypt in Genesis 37 is another classic place where we have two stories of how that happened and why, and they could not have existed separately because you can't have Joseph go to Egypt twice. It's easy enough.
Although you can't have Moses going up to the mountain twice.
You can have Moses going up the mountain as many times as you want. And in fact,
although it would have made sense if he just went up.
it would have. But this is the thing, right? It's actually very carefully done, so that things that we think of as nonsensical, right? There are 3 times that a patriarch goes to a foreign country and says, "My wife is actually my sister." Right? And to us, this is incomprehensible. Right? It's so dumb, right? Why would anyone do that? But the fact is, it is, what?
3
3 times, right? Why weren't those combined? Because the fact is, that can happen more than once. In fact, according to one author, it happened twice. But they don't say it can't happen more than once. Moses gets water from a well in virtually the exact same way, twice. Once in Exodus and once in Numbers. Is it basically the same story? Sure. But you can get water from a well twice. No one's going to say otherwise. Okay. But God can't reveal himself to the people on the one mountain that they meet him at in the wilderness more than once. Right? So there's one moment of that. People can't be born more than once. That's a big one, right? That's actually a major one. So again, Israel can't, the plagues, right? The plagues can't happen. You have the plagues happen and Pharaoh find it, and then they leave, and then the plagues happen again, right? The plagues have to, in two different versions, be interwoven. The splitting of the sea has to be interwoven, even though it happens in two different stories. So the question is then, why this? Right? Because this actually is two quite different episodes, right? We have a rebellion against the priestly leadership and a rebellion against the Mosaic leadership. Why is it that these stories have to be interwoven? Why is it that the person who put them together thought, I cannot have the Korah episode and then the Dathan Abiram episode, or vice versa? It's actually a very good question. There are not so many places where it's such a good question as it is here. And again, the best we can do is speculate, but it seems to me that both stories are meant to represent, in their independent sources, both of these episodes are the great moment of challenge to the leadership of the Israelite community. In the Dathan and Abiram story, which is part of the E narrative, Moses is the leader of the people, unquestionably, and this is the story of where people tried to challenge that, and they decisively lost, and it was proven at the end by divine miracle, that is the earth opening up, that you could never challenge Moses' leadership. Right? It was clearly and for the last time answered. And this is, in the priestly story, which includes Korah, the time when somebody rises up and challenges the leadership of the Israelites, which is Moses and Aaron, both of them together. And at the end of it, there are miracles, and it is clear at the end that if this can never happen again, and there's no question anymore, and there will never be another rebellion. And so if you had one of the stories ending with this definitive, the whole people now recognize that Moses or Aaron is in charge, and there is no question, and there was a miracle to prove it, and it says something like everyone recognized that there was never again to be a rebellion, you can't then have immediately after another one. Right? The rebellion against the Israelite leadership is the rebellion against the Israelite leadership. And if there are two, they have to become one, because it's inconceivable that it could have happened twice. That's the theory. Yes.
Couldn't you argue the other way, that it would actually be a more powerful story, sort of like Dathan and Abiram rebelled, they get crushed by God, Korah didn't get the memo, a little while later he does, and so God's backing him up again, and in some ways it's more powerful if you read it that way.
Yeah, I think the problem is that in both stories, all of Israel sees it happen, right, explicitly. Right? In the Dathan and Abiram story, right, everyone is gathered around the tents of these people, and the earth opens, and all of Israel says, we're going to die. And at the end of the Korah story, all of Israel is standing there watching the people get burned alive. So I think it would be very hard, because maybe Korah didn't get the message. Maybe if it's an individual, but it's Korah and 250 people. It's Dathan and Abiram and, their whole families. It's, again, it's speculative, but we try and come up with the best answers we can. But, here's the thing. If they were separate, I'd be making this the opposite argument. But there is a pattern, right? There's a pattern in all of the places where it's combined. That there is some functional similarity that it's just, they couldn't have happened more than once. And so when they're combined, I think there's got to be some reason along those lines.
If I may ask another question. Thanks to intertextual linkages, you have narratives in Samuel and Kings that echo or anticipate narratives in Genesis. Do you see and it's not clear which narrative was first, but it's absolutely clear.
Agreed.
Is it just semantic to ask whether they are layers, whether one is a layer and one is a source?
It's not just semantic. I think it's a really important and interesting question. But there are lots of classic examples, but you take the story of Amnon and Tamar, which is a great example because it has intertextual resonances with the story of Judah and Tamar, with the story of Dinah in Genesis 34, with the story of Joseph. Right? It's got this whole spectrum of what look like intertextual resonances. This material in Samuel there is, perfectly honest, I think it's actually just the same source. I think it's more than intertextual resonances. I think it's a continuous narrative from Genesis all the way through. But even if that weren't the case, I think that in that case, there's a really good argument to be made actually right along these lines. I could have used this as an example, that the intertextual references of the Amnon and Tamar story, I think, are resonant only with J stories in Genesis. And if that's the case, then it's not that the Amnon and Tamar story has to be a layer of J. It can be totally independent. But it would be good evidence for the independence of J. That somebody said, I will pick up on these stories, some of which are interwoven with other material. But a layer or a source, it depends on what scale you're looking at. In the Deuteronomistic history, there are sources and layers, as we know, right? That historian had much source material, including, I think, parts of J and other texts, and then he put layers on top, and there's probably layers on top of that. But that intertextual resonance is actually very akin to the sort of thing that I'm seeing here, and I think contributes to that conversation. What intertextual resonance is? What is it resonant with? What did that author know, or vice versa? I think it's the author of Samuel knowing the stuff in Genesis rather than vice versa. But I sometimes think that too, right? Because you look at the story of Amnon and Tamar, and you think that's the actual story of what happened, and all this is the sort of precursor material that was written to. I see it both ways. Then again, I also sort of, as I said, I see it all as being from one pen, so I don't need to make the argument so strongly one way or the other. Yes, please.
Yeah, I first wanted to say that I quite like your framework for distinguishing between sources and layers. I think it's very helpful in terms of how you've laid out the framework, whether a particular text disagrees about the major narrative themes or agrees. I just wondered if you'd had any thoughts about narrative markers within the text, things like Wiederaufnahme or like ellipsis or that kind of thing, whether particular ones might be used to introduce a layer versus a source, or whether that doesn't correspond at all.
Yeah. That's a really good question. This is one of those situations where scholars tend to correctly identify rhetorical devices, right? Wiederaufnahme, right? Resumptive repetition is a classic one. Right? That is, for those unfamiliar, right? You will get a sentence in the text, and then there will be sort of a digression, and then at the end there's a sentence that links back to before the digression and catches up to where we were before we went off path and continues with the story. It is almost universally thought that this is a marker of redactional work. That every time you see resumptive repetition, you have a clear marker of somebody has inserted something and then brought us back into the story. I think that's, I'll just say wrong. Editors, good editors, who want to include their material into a story. Good editors use the techniques of authors. That is, digression and resumption is something that an author does. And we see it, there are plenty of examples of places where this is clear. And editors pick up this technique of writing, it's a writing technique, this technique of digression as a way of marking their insertions, or making their insertions actually less obvious. But that's what a resumptive repetition does. It allows you to sneak an addition into the text without it actually being disruptive. Right, because you say, and then you come back to it. Right? Without the resumption, right, you've got it. So I think that Yeah, so my feeling is that it's not that you can't, it's not that these markers, these rhetorical markers, don't mark editorial insertions or layers, because they certainly can. It's that they don't necessarily, right? Seeing one doesn't mean I've got a secondary edition, right? There's got to be something else that really proves the point. Of course, there are plenty of places where you will get layers without these sorts of markers. I think probably the entire holiness code is a good example, right? There is no resumptive repetition there. It's just continuous because it can be. So, in other words, it's a long answer to a reasonable question. Yes, it is always useful to see those and to think about what they mean, but we just can't knee-jerk say, okay, I've seen a resumptive repetition, so I must have a layer. Sometimes, but not always. And I think, sometimes but not always would be a good motto for biblical scholarship.
In addition to looking at layers and sources, do you have historical interest in looking at cultural borrowings that are in the Pentateuch, for instance? A lot of names that are there are Egyptian names in origin. The tent of meeting may have its origin in the funeral tent of the pharaoh, maybe Persian words, Zoroastrian ideas. I mean, is that part of your deciphering layers and sources?
It's not, and I'll tell you why. As I suggested, for me, the driving and almost sole basis on which to separate sources is what I'm calling narrative contradictions or problems. It's problematic to my mind if we try to identify authors or layers or anything like that on the basis of something like external cultural references. Right? Not to say they aren't there, they're clearly there. But if, for example, if we were to say of every text that looks like it has Babylonian influence, I'm going to call all of that something. I'll call all of that the Babylonian layer. What you end up with is a text that has no literary integrity, right? It has no narrative coherence, right? The key is a text produced at any point has to have narrative coherence, otherwise no one will ever be able to read it.
It has to have it? Well, you said the flood narrative doesn't, though, doesn't it? Or this, in a sense, doesn't have narrative coherence. That's why we're separated.
That's right.
So we created a text without narrative coherence.
Right, but it is, at the same time, the way this text was produced was with at least some concept, right? It's not a complete jumble. It is in at least chronological order. And things that can't happen twice don't happen twice. That is, there is some narrative mind recognizing what's going on. Trying to do the best he can with material. But when you look at, let's say, originally authored rather than compiled edited texts, there's also the question of making an argument. Right? The compiled text of the Torah, I don't think is making a particularly great argument. But an author writing necessarily is. Right? No author writes without something to say. And if the thing you're trying to say is impossible to get at because your text is unreadable, I guess you're just a bad author. I just don't think that there are too many bad authors in the Bible. So, where was I? So, thanks. No, it's good. So where was
It was a layer.
Right, that's right. That was. So let me resumptively. Right. So on sort of historical dating and cultural references, right? It's just a question of starting point. If you start with that sort of thing as a means by which you try to separate, then you're not going to end up with coherent narratives, which I think is the issue. Right? Again, if the narrative of the Pentateuch were completely coherent from start to finish, and there were Egyptian and Assyrian and various references, we would never think it was more than one author. Right? We would just think it was an author who was access to various sources. So in other words, the mechanism by which we analyze the text has to be fundamentally related to the reason we need to analyze the text in the first place. The reason is I can't read it as a narrative. That's why the plot doesn't work. So it's a plot issue. If we couldn't read it because, for example, if you try to read the book of Isaiah and you can't read it because it's got references to, the 8th century stuff, and then suddenly it has references to 6th century stuff. Right? That's why we divide the text of Isaiah that way. That's the issue with Isaiah. Right? It's obviously not narrative coherence. Right? There's hardly any narrative there. So again, right, it's different problems lead to different solutions, different avenues for those solutions. All a long way of saying that I am very interested in entertaining cultural references, intercultural references, once I have separated the sources on narrative grounds. As once I have a text that I know is a reasonable data set to work with, now I'm perfectly happy to say, and what does it know? And how can I explain that? And what does that mean? And how does that affect the message it's trying to get across? But I can't start there. In the same way that I can't start with style. Right? The question of divine names, which is in almost every textbook, right? The way that we divide, right? The reason we divide the sources is because one uses the tetragrammaton and one says Elohim, says God, and that's right, for hundreds of years, since John Ostrup, that's why we've been doing this. This is nonsense. If we divide the text on the basis purely of style, you end up with narratives that don't work. If you divide the text on the basis of narratives, you end up seeing that that the divine names break out in interesting and important ways. But you can't start with the divine names, or you end up with junk, narratives that don't work. So I'm perfectly happy to use style once I've divided up the text into sources. I mean, there are plenty of classic examples. In the old days of scholarship, when style was held to be much more important as a means of dividing texts, you would get analyses that would say, this word belongs to this source. So every time I see it in a half verse, in a verse, here, there, I have to say, that belongs to there. And you end up with misshapen and partial and fragmentary narratives, right? As if everybody who was writing in ancient Israel didn't speak the same language and have the same vocabulary, right? They all knew that word. Right? So if, after analysis, it turns out that a word is used by only one source, that's very nice. If it turns out it's used 100 times in one source and twice in another, that's okay too. Different authors have different styles, and they use words differently. I use some words far too much. I recognize this about myself. Right? You might think from reading me that the M dash belongs exclusively to me. But that's not to say that that I can't use I use a semicolon now and then. It's not a different source, it's just a different style that I employed for that moment. But if I suddenly contradicted myself radically, that would be a problem. So this is the theory behind, the approach at least, to why we analyze the text and therefore how we do it. And there are lots, and like I said, there are lots of theme, theology, style, divine names, historical reference, all those things I'm really happy to entertain once I have a text with which to entertain them.
Have textual scholars ever experimented very much with trying to establish an archaeological context or a sort of real-life context by which to understand the way literary tradition develops and which levels may be earlier? Mm-hmm. Isn't that part of the context?
Yep. Absolutely. The reason to do literary material is to get at the history, right? So certainly there have been lots of attempts for a long, long time, Wellhausen being the most famous, but plenty of attempts to date each of the sources, to fix them into a social location within ancient Israel. And I think those attempts are perfectly valid and indeed sort of the necessary endpoint here.
I'm thinking of recent attempts, not the older ones, which have failed.
Right, so what you'll find, which I failed, I'm so glad you said that, because they very much have failed for a variety of reasons. Recent scholarship, recognizing again that there are two, at this point, I think, two basic major approaches. There is a revision of the Wellhausen classic documentary hypothesis that I consider myself part of, and there is the whole European sphere of there are no sources whatsoever, right? The layers of people. Almost all of us have, at least for the moment, stepped back from the dating and historical context issue. And I'll tell you why, and it's not that we're not interested. It's that we recognized, as you correctly pointed out, the failure of the earlier attempts to do this. So dating became like style, right? It became one of these things where you look at a text and say, ah, that looks later, so it must be whatever source. And this simply ended up not working for the reasons I've discussed. And so what we all, at least implicitly, realized is we have to simply treat this as literature and literary analysis first and foremost, and we'll work on that. And at some point, then, in theory, we can get to dating of it. The problem is, and I'm almost willing to do that at this point. The problem is we've had such a tough time convincing ourselves and everybody else of which is actually the right analysis that we're all still bogged down in the literary part. If we could all agree JEPD, then we could talk. Or if we could all agree lots of layers, then we could talk. But we have, in many ways, stepped back from sort of the realia of these texts.
And so have we. I mean, on our side, we can't manage to date things very well either. And the controversies are absolutely vicious in archaeology. So that's why I think we're locked into two monologues, which is not very helpful.
Right. I think we're very much in the same place in Intertextual studies. What I'll say is, I'm appreciative of the lack of dating, if only because it recognizes that. I mean, one of the problems of the old model, the Wellhausen model, and essentially the century after him, was that textual. Was it this idea that the sources developed one after another, right? The evolutionary scheme. So the first was J, and then E, and then D, and then P, and they each represent the evolution of Israelite religion, which is what made it so appealing at the time. These days we are, I think, mostly conscious of the fact that it is possible that Israel had different ideas at the same time. And so it's no longer necessary to say, oh, well, this must be a development from that, or vice versa. I'm very happy, and I'm actually relatively convinced, very happy to say that J and E and D and P, more accurately, the ideas about Israelite religion encoded therein, all existed simultaneously for most of Israel's history.
The archaeological record would support that.
I know it would.
Of course.
I definitely know that. So that's that's a way of saying dating is much more complicated once you realize that they could have existed over the span of Israel's history. You're no longer tied to say, oh well, this must be later or earlier. It could be both actually in many layers.
Now, I know that you wouldn't use historical linguistics necessarily to start dating.
I was wondering if you were going to bring up the historical linguistics.
You
Can't help myself. I have no problem.
But, for me, it keeps getting worse. So in other words, the more research I do, the more entrenched I become in my old ideas.
Okay, so to be fair, I like your old ideas. They're very nice. I have been, Ron Handel teaches at Berkeley, and I'm sure you may know well. Ron once said to me, I agree with all of your arguments, and my only problem is you're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. He said, bring out the historical linguistic data. They have no answer to, he's very convinced, as I think you are, that there is a clear distinction to be made between different layers of Biblical Hebrew, and you can see that, where one, I'll get that. You can see that what is accused of being late is not. and that what I might say is relatively early seems to be, and that it is useful data. So I do. I fight the battle without that because I think it's
It's a separate battle.
well, it certainly can be used, but my feeling is I want, as I said sort of this at the beginning, right? I want as narrow a route toward my conclusions as possible, right? I want to be able to say it is narrative claims, it is plot, and I can get at it just from that avenue. And I think that I can. And now I just want people arguing with me on this. And if I bring in a separate avenue that gets me to the same place, then I can get people arguing about that part, and then they start rejecting. I like the cleanness of the argument. I like it very much when other people make the historical linguistic argument, which I'm frankly not as qualified to make as most.
But then, it becomes part of the meaning of and the purpose of the text. That is, authors tend to write in certain social contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And it does make a huge difference whether P is a Persian text or whether it's a late Iron Age text,
Mm-hmm.
for example. I mean, there are different issues. I think the linguistic arguments, it's really nice the way you've set this up, because in some ways it solves what was perceived as one of the problems of making P a pre-exilic text, which was you want to have this sort of evolutionary development of sources, where once you recognize, hey, you can have lots of different thoughts at the same time in a culture, lots of dialogue going on. It sort of solves the problem. And the basic problem is, like, when you look at the Pentateuch, there is no Persian word in the Pentateuch. There are Persian words, and it's just like it's not like
H dot. Yeah, I'm joking.
You can't really do that. So once you decide, hey, this is all pre-exilic in one form or another, sure, you can have a post-exilic layer, but it can't be very big, because if it was very big, it would have to betray.
You have to see it. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they were sitting there and saying, oh, I don't want to use a Persian word, because we have all sorts of literature written in the Persian period, and they're using all sorts of Persian words without any second thought about it. And probably not even realizing, the etymology. I mean, it's not like they took seminars with Frank Moore Cross and therefore knew these were Persian words, right?
Right. Their historical Semitic linguistics were, I'm safe to say, poor. What I would say is this, and I agree with everything you're saying, and I just want to, it's just for clarity, and I become repetitive at a certain point, but you can only date P once you know what P is.
Yeah.
To say, the question of where to date P and how it relates to the other sources can only be undertaken once you have, on purely literary grounds, said this is P and this is not. And at that point, now let's have the discussion about whether P is pre-exilic or post-exilic or Persian or Iron Age or whatever it may be, and what language uses. But as you know, right, you can't analyze the language of a source until you have the source to analyze. Otherwise, you have a false data set, and your conclusions are all, especially in something that is as reasonably objective as historical linguistics. You have to have the right data, otherwise you're
in this case, though, I could say for the entire Pentateuch.
Yeah, I agree with you.
There's no Persian.
I agree. I agree, which is, maybe they skipped it, maybe it's just Hellenistic, as some people would be happy to say.
Well, but how about trying to show, as I have, that some of these stories fit very well in the Iron Age and not at all in the Persian or Hellenistic period?
Absolutely. I mean, look, when it comes to the question of individual episodes and the traditions that stand behind them, I think that, it's not even true. I would say I think that most people would admit that they have more of an Iron Age basis. But I know I was just speaking with one of my esteemed European colleagues who was arguing, very strongly that certain stories in the Pentateuch are clearly about the Persian period. So it becomes subjective. When it becomes a question, I would say this, when it becomes a question of, does this story fit better in this period or in this period? then that's a hard argument
But
to
back
make.
to dating, many of these scholars know next to nothing about the Persian period, so they can put anything they want to.
Well, it's because very few people at all, I mean, I think that as a rule, we know very little about the Persian period.
Well,
And
we know more than some of these scholars think.
that's true. My colleague, John Collins, of whom we were speaking earlier, repeatedly points out that there's actually not very much Persian period literature. And then suddenly these scholars are arguing that almost everything in the Pentateuch is Persian period.
You would have a hard time putting in the Persian period the sort of academy it would take to produce this literature.
That is absolutely another issue, right? On the technical front, how did this get made? What is the scribal situation? Actually, I think you have argued at length, right, that you have a very distinct scribal communities and schools in various periods, and there are places and times when it makes sense for this sort of thing to be produced, and the Persian period ain't one of them.
Davies and I once had a great exchange about that in Rome. It was great fun.
In person or in print?
In person. In blood.
That's what I'm saying, to be a fly on the wall. Right, but so yeah, I mean, the dating stuff is all very, is all interesting, and certainly is very useful. And again, I think it is important to be able to say sometimes, I'm not able. I can do relative dating sometimes. D I know is later than J and E, but J and E I don't know their relative dating, and P I can date virtually anywhere. I don't think there's anything in that text that decisively puts it in one place or another, and that to me is exactly as it should be. If I can't date them, then let's think about them as contemporaries and long-term, again, layers, right? Layers and layers of writing over many centuries, and schools and social contexts, but simultaneous as opposed to evolution.
Well, I want to thank everyone, especially Dr. Joel Blund for his very insightful seminar and discussion. And hopefully see you all here next week for